Trapped by darkness, the devil inside us. Hook. Have you ever felt trapped in darkness, as if something was lurking inside you, controlling your every move? What if the only way out was to face the very thing you feared most? Join me on a chilling journey through the shadows, where the line between fear and freedom blurs, and the truth is darker than you could ever imagine. Stay till the end, because the twist will leave you speechless. The house was silent. The air thick with dust. The walls felt cold. Too cold. The flicker of a dim light bulb above gave little comfort. The floorboards groaned under each step. Sasha's breath came out in short bursts. Each exhale echoed in the empty hall. The hallway stretched ahead, swallowed by shadows. She felt her pulse quicken. A faint sound. Barely a whisper. From behind. Sasha froze. Her eyes darted toward the back of the house. Nothing. Just the silence. The heavy silence that hung around her like a weight. She tried to steady herself. But the air seemed to press against her chest. She took another step. The house felt alive. The shadows shifted. Not naturally. Her heart hammered in her ears. The floor beneath her creaked again. This time, it wasn't her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A flicker of movement in the corner of her vision. Sasha spun around. There was nothing there. Yet the feeling lingered. A presence. Watching. Waiting. She turned back to the hallway, her eyes tracing every inch. The hallway seemed endless now. A door at the far end. Half open. Behind it, a shadow. A shape. Looming. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The figure shifted. Not human. A distortion? Like a ripple in the air. Sasha's body froze. Her mind screamed for her to run. But her feet refused. The shadow reached toward her. Slow. Too slow. But the air thickened. Tighter. The figure grew larger. Closer. Sasha's eyes burned. Her pulse quickened, erratic. She had to move. Had to escape. The door slammed shut. Behind her. Sasha whirled around. The hallway was empty. But the air was no longer cold. It was suffocating. A feeling crawled up her spine. Something was wrong. More than wrong. The walls seemed to lean in. Closer. Closer. Sasha stumbled backward. Her body screamed to run, but she couldn't. The light flickered again. And then, the whisper. Not from behind. Not from the house. From within. A voice. Her own. But wrong. So wrong. It spoke her name. And the darkness responded. The darkness, it answered. Not with words. But with a sound. A low hum. A vibration that rattled her bones. Sasha stumbled back, eyes wide. Her mouth opened, but no scream came out. The air pressed in tighter. Tighter still. Her chest felt like it was caving in. The floor beneath her feet twisted. Shifting. Like it was breathing. The walls bent inward. Closing in on her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. A figure appeared. Not human. Not at all. Its shape was wrong, distorted. A blur of limbs, stretching unnaturally. The flickering light revealed glimpses of its face. Hollow eyes. Black. Deep as endless pits. It grinned. A smile too wide for any human to have. And it whispered her name. Sasha's knees buckled. She fell to the ground. Her hands trembling. The house was alive. Every inch of it. The walls groaned. The floor moaned. The shadows twisted and writhed. She couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her eyes locked onto the figure. It stepped closer. Each movement deliberate. Slow. Unhurried. The ground beneath her began to shift again. Bending upward. As though the house itself was swallowing her. The temperature dropped. Frost crept up the walls. Her breath formed clouds in the air. Sasha's head spun. She tried to crawl away. But her hands wouldn't move. They were frozen to the floor. The figure stopped in front of her. Its face was inches from hers now. The darkness inside its eyes swallowed everything. Sasha wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, sealed shut. The figure leaned in closer. Its breath, cold as death. Whispers filled her mind. Not just words. Images. Dark, twisted images. Her own face, twisted with terror. Her body broken. Her soul slipping away. The whispers turned to laughter. Laughter that scraped at her sanity. The walls seemed to close in even further. She was drowning. Suffocating. And then a voice. Her own voice. But not her own. It called out to her. It was calling her name. Again. The voice, it was hers. But not hers. It rang out, harsh and hollow. A mockery. Her own name twisted in the air. Sasha tried to scream, but the sound was smothered by the walls. The darkness pressed in around her. The figure was right there. She could feel its breath on her skin. Cold. Ice cold. The laughter grew louder. Deeper. Filling the room. Filling her mind. The floor beneath her trembled. Vibrated. Her heart raced, but her body was numb. Frozen in place. The figure leaned closer, its grin widening. She could see its teeth now. Sharp. Too sharp. Like blades. Its eyes, they were empty voids. Sasha's breath caught in her throat. It reached out, its hand so close. So cold. She felt its fingers brush against her skin. Her body jolted in a shudder of panic. The air was thick with something foul. A smell. Rotting. Decay. Sasha's vision blurred. The world seemed to spin. And then. Silence. The laughter stopped. The whispering stopped. The weight lifted. The figure was gone. She was alone. But the silence felt wrong. Too heavy. The walls still trembled, pulsing with a low hum. Sasha's chest tightened. Her heart thudded painfully in her ribs. Something wasn't right. She forced herself to move. Slowly, shakily, she crawled toward the door. Her hands scraped against the cold, uneven floor. Every movement felt like a struggle. As if the house itself was pulling her back. She reached the door frame. Her fingers brushed against the cold wood. It was locked. Her pulse quickened. Her breath shallow. No. No, no, no. She pulled at the door. But it wouldn't budge. Her fingers trembled violently. The whisper returned. Not from the figure. Not from the walls. From within her. Sasha's chest constricted. Her vision blurred again. The voice was louder. Clearer. It was inside her head now. Inside her soul. A voice so familiar. Her own voice. And yet, twisted. It whispered to her. Calmly. Invitingly. Let me in, Sasha. The cold deepened. The shadows reached out again. Closer. 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 The shadows closed in around her. Thick. Suffocating. Sasha could feel them creeping along her skin. Cold fingers brushing her face. Her body trembled, but she couldn't move. The voice in her mind, it grew louder. More insistent. Let me in, Sasha. It whispered again. Let me in. She clenched her teeth, fighting it. Fighting the voice. Fighting the pull. But her hands moved on their own. Her fingers gripped the door, pulling harder. Desperate. The wood creaked, groaned under the pressure. And then. It opened. A crack. A sliver of light. Just enough to see the hallway stretching out before her. Empty. But something shifted in the corner of her eye. A shape. A shadow. Looming. Too still. Too silent. Sasha's heart skipped a beat. The voice was in her head again. Closer. Right behind her now. Come on, Sasha. It murmured. You can't escape. You never could. Her breath hitched. It was right. She couldn't escape. Her feet were moving again, of their own accord. toward the hallway, toward the darkness. Her eyes locked on the shadow at the end of the hall. The figure was there. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything. It was a distortion, like a broken mirror reflecting something twisted. Something that shouldn't exist. Sasha couldn't stop herself. Her feet carried her forward, each step heavier than the last. Her fingers grazed the walls. Cold. Ice cold. Her pulse echoed louder in her ears. She could feel the voice. It was inside her now. It was her. She was the voice. Sasha turned the corner. The door at the end of the hall was open. The same door. The one she thought she had locked. It beckoned. The darkness behind it was deeper than before. It pulled at her. With invisible hands. Drawing her in. Sasha stood at the threshold. Her body shaking. But she couldn't move. Couldn't resist. Her reflection stared back at her from the blackness. Not her face. Not the one she knew. But something darker. Something hollow. Sasha stepped forward. And the door slammed shut behind her. The last thing she heard was the voice. Her voice. But it wasn't hers anymore. "Welcome home," it whispered. The walls trembled as the door slammed shut. A deafening sound. Louder than anything she had ever heard. Sasha gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The darkness enveloped her. It was thick. Oppressive. She couldn't see anything. Couldn't breathe. The cold was suffocating. Her body shivered uncontrollably. But still, she moved forward. Step after step. Her feet carried her. She didn't want to go. She didn't want this. But she couldn't stop. The voice whispered again. "Keep going, Sasha. You're almost there." Her hands reached out, blindly, grazing the cold, damp walls. The texture was wrong. Rough. Gravelly. Like the walls were breathing, too. Her fingers slid along the stone surface. Then, something caught her attention. A low sound. A thud. Then another. And another. Each one felt like it was coming closer. Closer to her. Her breath became shallow, quick. The thuds grew louder. Faster. A frantic pounding, as if something was chasing her. She turned around. But there was nothing. Only the endless, suffocating blackness. Her heart raced, her pulse like a drumbeat in her ears. She couldn't escape. Her feet moved faster now. Her body moved without her consent. The thuds grew louder. And then, a cold hand gripped her wrist. Sasha's blood ran cold. Her body froze. The air around her thickened again. Suffocating. The hand didn't let go. It pulled her toward the darkness. She tried to scream. But the sound died in her throat. A voice whispered in her ear, a laugh so soft, so cold. "You can't run from yourself, Sasha." The voice was hers. But not hers. It echoed in her mind, in the walls, in the very air she breathed. Her vision blurred again, the shadows closing in tighter. Her knees buckled, her hands trembling as they gripped the wall. Something pulled her forward. Dragged her deeper. The shadows consumed her. Swallowed her whole. And then, the silence returned. The silence was deafening. Heavy. Unforgiving. Sasha tried to open her eyes. But they wouldn't move. Her body was frozen. Trapped. The weight of the darkness pressed down on her, suffocating her. Her mind screamed, but her mouth couldn't form a sound. The cold seeped deeper into her bones. She felt like she was sinking. Falling. Into nothing. Then a shift. A small movement. A crack. A faint light flickered in the distance. It wasn't warm. Not comforting. But it was there. It called to her. Her body responded, against her will. Her feet moved. Slowly. Dragging her through the thick, oppressive darkness. Each step felt like a mile. The light grew brighter. But the closer she got, the heavier the air became. The shadows around her shifted. Twisting. Contorting. Sasha's breath came in ragged gasps. The light ahead flickered again, dimming, then brightening. Her pulse raced. A soft whisper in her ear again. That voice. Her voice. "You're so close, Sasha." She stopped. Frozen. Her fingers twitched. The light was just ahead, barely a few steps away. She reached for it. But as her fingers brushed the edge of the light, it vanished. The light snapped out like a candle in the wind. And in its place, a figure appeared. Not human. Not anything. It was just wrong. A shifting, writhing shape. Its eyes were black holes. Its face twisted. Sasha's breath caught in her throat. It opened its mouth. The whisper echoed again. "You can't run. Not anymore." The figure stepped closer. Closer. Each movement unnatural, like it didn't belong in the world. The shadows stretched out behind it, stretching toward her. Sasha backed away, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot. The cold wrapped around her like chains. The figure was so close now. She could feel its presence. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its eyes, they were everywhere. Inside her. Her mind. Her soul. And then, it smiled. A grin too wide. Too cold. Sasha tried to scream. But nothing came out. She reached for the darkness. For anything. But the figure reached out faster, grabbing her wrist. Cold. So cold. The touch burned through her skin. The darkness closed in once more. Tighter. Her vision blurred. The whispers grew louder. And then, she was gone. The world was still. Empty. Sasha couldn't feel anything. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The silence was worse than the darkness. It stretched on endless. Her mind was a void. The air, if there was any, felt thin. Unreal. Something shifted. A sound, soft at first. Barely a whisper. Sasha strained to hear it. It was her name. Her name, spoken from the depths of the void. But it didn't sound right. It was distorted. Twisted. Her own voice, but broken. Distant. The voice echoed through her mind. "Come back, Sasha." She tried to respond. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Her hands felt heavy. She tried to lift them, but they wouldn't move. There was a pressure building deep in her chest. Her heartbeat echoed, steady at first, then frantic. Like something was clawing its way out of her. The silence returned, but now it was suffocating. A weight pushing down on her. Her body was screaming to move. To run. But there was nothing to run from. Nothing to fight. Just the sound of her name, again. It came from everywhere. Inside. Outside. In every corner of her mind. "Come back." The voice was clearer now. Closer. Sasha's eyes snapped open. But there was no light. Only black. She reached out blindly. Her fingers brushed something soft. Warm. It didn't feel real. Her heart raced. The warmth became colder. The shadows pressed against her again. Sharp pain shot through her chest. Her skin felt tight, as if it no longer belonged to her. Her fingers moved slowly. The pressure in her chest was unbearable. The voice. It was inside her now. "You're not escaping, Sasha." The walls around her closed in. Crushing. Suffocating. Her body stiffened, every muscle fighting against the pull. She tried to pull herself away, but something held her still. Something inside her. The pain in her chest intensified. She couldn't breathe. The pressure grew unbearable. And then, her body jerked violently. As if something had snapped. Sasha's eyes widened in horror as the shadows swirled around her. And then, she saw it. The reflection. Her own face. But it wasn't hers anymore. It was twisted. Hollow. Dead. The figure in the shadows. The voice, her voice. It smiled. "Welcome back, Sasha." The darkness embraced her completely. The darkness swallowed her whole. She didn't struggle. No fight left in her. Her body was no longer hers. The reflection, that twisted version of her face, stared back. Unblinking. Empty. Her own eyes, hollow and lifeless, mirrored the emptiness that was consuming her. The shadows tightened, wrapping around her like chains. She felt them inside her, coursing through her veins. The cold burned. It wasn't a burn that left marks. It was a burn that sank deep, inside her bones. Her heart still beat, but it felt like a distant memory. The voice, her voice, it was everywhere. Echoing. Bouncing off the walls of her mind. "You were always meant for this, Sasha," it whispered. She couldn't remember who she was anymore. The echoes of the past faded into nothing. Everything was so quiet now. Except for that voice. It was the only thing left. The only thing that mattered. Sasha's body moved again, not by her will. It was as if something else had taken control. She wasn't walking anymore. She was floating. Dragged through the endless, suffocating dark. The temperature dropped. Frost crawled along the floor. Up her legs. Choking her, freezing her. But still she moved. Her reflection, no, the thing that used to be her, followed. It walked beside her, step for step, its hollow eyes never leaving her. The room around her began to shift. The shadows stretched. They twisted into shapes that didn't belong. Familiar shapes. Familiar places. A house. Her house. Her home. The air stank of rot. Of decay. It was her house, but wrong. Nothing was where it should be. Nothing was as it had been. The walls were scarred, burned. The floor was cracked and broken. Sasha's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The voice. It wasn't in her mind now. It was coming from the house. From the walls. From the floors. It called her name. Sasha. Sasha. Her name echoed again. Sasha didn't speak. She couldn't. The shadows moved toward her, creeping along the walls. Closer. Closer. Her reflection grinned. Wide. Too wide. Sasha's eyes filled with terror. Something was wrong. Something deep inside her. And then she saw it. The door. The door she had passed in the hallway. The one that never should have been opened. The door with the blackness beyond. Her heart thudded in her chest. It was waiting for her. The darkness was waiting. And she knew. She knew what lay beyond it. The voice spoke one final time. "Welcome home, Sasha." And the door slammed open. The shadows rushed in. The darkness enveloped her completely. And then, there was nothing. There was no sound. No light. No warmth. Only the crushing, suffocating blackness. Sasha couldn't move. Couldn't think. It felt as though time itself had stopped. She was trapped in a place where nothing existed, except her. Her thoughts were shattered, broken fragments, scattered in the void. But something pulled at her. A tug. Deep within. It wasn't a thought. It was a feeling. A call. It was the voice. Her voice. The darkness around her began to shift. It didn't part, but it moved. Slowly, deliberately. There was no escape. But the pull was stronger now. Closer. Closer still. Sasha's mind screamed, desperate to understand. But there was no time for understanding. The weight of it all, of the darkness, of the cold, of the pressure, began to crush her. She could feel the echoes of something lurking just out of sight. A shape in the distance. A flicker. A movement. Then the walls closed in. Tighter. The walls, if they were even walls, pressed against her skin, against her soul. Her heartbeat quickened. Her chest tightened. The cold was unbearable. The voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't just in her mind. It was all around her. It echoed in the silence. In the very fabric of the blackness. "I never left, Sasha," it said. "I've always been here." The pull became unbearable. She couldn't breathe. The shadows clawed at her. At her body. At her mind. Her hands jerked, reaching into the darkness. Her fingers brushed against something solid. A door? No, not a door. A wall. Cold stone. The space was no longer a void. It was a prison. And she was the one trapped inside it. The shadows started to twist. They began to take form. Not human. Not anything. But they surrounded her. Pulsing. Shifting. And then, the face appeared. The twisted face. Her reflection. But not hers. It was the one she had seen before. The one that had grinned. The eyes. Those hollow eyes. It was her, but not. The reflection in the shadows smiled. And Sasha felt the last of her will slip away. No longer a person. No longer herself. Only a shadow. Only a whisper. You're mine now, the reflection said, its voice a twisted echo of her own. And the darkness swallowed her whole once again. The silence returned. Heavy. Endless. But there was no peace in it. Only a deep, gnawing emptiness. Sasha couldn't tell how long she had been there. Time didn't exist in the blackness. The cold wrapped tighter around her. It felt like her skin was stretching, tearing. She was no longer sure where her body ended and the shadows began. The figure, the reflection, it was still there. Looming in the corner of her mind. A specter. A presence that couldn't be shaken. It called to her. Do you feel it now? The voice asked. The weight of what you've become. Sasha's pulse thundered in her ears. Her heart beat slower, but louder, as if each thud was louder than the last. She reached out, but there was nothing to grasp. Nothing to hold on to. The shadows swirled around her. They were changing. The coldness was turning darker. Heavier. It was as if the very air itself was turning against her. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was closing in. A pressure, like a vice, wrapping around her lungs. Her vision began to blur. Her hands shook uncontrollably. A pain. Sharp. Seizing her chest. The darkness. It wasn't just around her anymore. It was inside her. She was becoming it. She was becoming the reflection. The laughter came again, deep and hollow. It wasn't just the voice now. It was the world around her. The walls seemed to mock her. The air turned thick with dread. The cold that had become so familiar, was now seeping through her veins. The voice whispered again, closer now, so close she could feel it in her bones. You can't run. You never could. The reflection's eyes, those hollow, dark pits, filled her vision. They consumed her. Sasha could feel her will slip further away. She was no longer Sasha. She was something else. Something darker. The shadows pressed in around her, pulling tighter with each passing moment. Her body trembled violently now, but she didn't fight it. There was no fight left in her. Only the deep, endless pull of the void. And as the last remnants of her mind fractured, as the world twisted into unrecognizable shapes, one thing remained clear. The voice, the reflection, it was her. It had always been her. And she had become it. The shadows wrapped around her completely. And in that final instant, before everything went dark, the last whisper rang out in her mind. Welcome home, Sasha. And the darkness swallowed her once more. The darkness stretched, infinite and suffocating. There was no escape. No light. No sound. Sasha's consciousness flickered, like a dying ember. A spark of recognition lingered in the farthest corner of her mind. She remembered something. A name. Her name. Sasha. But it wasn't her name anymore. It was a hollow echo. A hollow promise. The cold around her twisted, pressing in like invisible hands. They pulled at her. Gripped her. Her body, though still trembling, felt distant. Detached. Not hers. Not anything. The shadows swirled, coiling, feeding on her thoughts, her essence. Every part of her that once knew peace, now consumed by a void that whispered. That voice. Her voice. It was louder now. Closer. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar shaking her bones. You are nothing now. You were always meant to be nothing. Sasha felt her heart skip. Her breath caught in her chest. The voice wrapped around her consciousness, threading through her mind. Familiar. Sickening. Her reflection had become her. She had become it. And now, she was fading. Dissolving into the dark. Into the shadow. Into nothing. But still, the voice came. Louder. Closer. Don't fight it. You belong to me now. The cold spread further, deeper inside her. It took root in her very soul. A weight heavier than anything she had ever known. It crushed her. And yet she felt nothing. No pain. No fear. No anger. Just an emptiness that filled every corner of her being. The walls of this place, they closed in even tighter. Sasha didn't know where she ended and the dark began anymore. She was both. And neither. Her thoughts blurred. Her memories faded. The weight of the dark around her pressed deeper. She was trapped. Not just in this place, but in herself. And then, it happened. A shift. A tremor. Something flickered. A crack in the dark. A tiny spark of light. For just a moment, Sasha felt a warmth. It was fleeting. But real. Something from the world she had known. A memory. But it was gone before she could grasp it. And then the voice returned. The voice that had always been hers. The voice that had taken over. The reflection, her reflection, smiled from the shadows. You can never leave, Sasha. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sasha felt something stir. A spark of defiance. A whisper of resistance. But it was too late. The darkness closed in. Tighter. And the shadows, thick with cold, swallowed her whole. The void was suffocating. A cold so deep, so vast, it spread through her entire being. Sasha could no longer tell if she was moving or still. The darkness consumed everything. Her body, her thoughts, her very essence, it was all slipping away. And yet, there was a pull. A whisper. Soft at first, like a faraway murmur. Then louder. Closer. It called her name again. Sasha. The voice was different this time. It was not the twisted, mocking reflection of her own. It was something else. Something familiar. Something real. The warmth of it reached her like a faint glimmer in the blackness. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. But she could feel it. A spark of something. Hope? No. It was too distant. Too fragile. Her mind struggled to grasp it. The shadows pressed tighter, suffocating. But the whisper, it lingered. It was a plea. Please, Sasha. Her heart pounded against her ribs. A single breath, sharp and ragged, pierced the suffocating stillness. And for a fleeting moment, she remembered. She remembered who she was. Who she had been. A single thought cut through the black. She had a choice. She could still choose. The voice, it had called her. Not to consume her. Not to trap her. But to remind her. Sasha's fingers twitched. Just a small movement. She felt the pressure of the darkness around her, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just holding her. It was waiting. It was waiting for her to make a choice. To accept it. To become it. Or to resist. With all her strength, with everything she had left, Sasha focused on the warmth, the voice. She could hear it more clearly now. Don't let go, Sasha! She wanted to scream, a slow, but no sound came toward the light. Her heart was thundering in her chest. Her reflection, her body felt the heavy, twisted version but of herself, the urge to fight, lurked to resist, in the corner of her surged mind, through her like a wildfire. But she was stronger. The shadows clawed at her skin. She was still Sasha. Soul. But the light grew brighter. She didn't sink back into them. Please! She pushed. Her hands, pushed against the crushing weight now of the gripped the air around her. Her breath came faster. There was something there, more desperate, something solid. The shadows around her hissed, angry. The darkness screamed in frustration. She felt her body as she moved. Her mind, but she was no longer afraid. She wasn't running. She was fighting. And in that moment she knew. The darkness would not win. The voice in her mind, the one that had always been hers, echoed one last time. Don't let go, Sasha. And with that, she pulled herself forward, reaching for the light. The light, fragile and distant, flickered before her. It was all she had left. The shadows around her writhed in fury, twisting like serpents, reaching, clawing at her skin. But Sasha, no, she was stronger now. The cold, suffocating darkness pressed in from all sides, but the warmth of the light called to her, urging her forward, tugging at her very soul. With every ounce of strength she could summon, she pushed against the weight of the darkness, feeling it pull at her, trying to drag her back into the void. But she didn't stop. Her fingers reached forward, brushing the edge of the light. A flicker of warmth spread through her body, chasing away the biting cold that had plagued her for so long. Sasha's heart thundered in her chest as she fought to move, to tear herself free from the clutches of the shadows. Her reflection, the twisted version of herself, was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind. Its hollow eyes followed her every movement, its jagged grin widening, whispering in her ears. You cannot escape me, it hissed. But Sasha refused to listen. The light was growing stronger now, a brilliant pulse that filled the space around her, slowly pushing the darkness back. Her mind was clear, the fog lifting with every step she took toward the warmth. The reflection screamed, its voice echoing in the vast emptiness, but it was fading, growing weaker with each breath Sasha took. She was not who it wanted her to be. She was Sasha. And she wasn't giving in. With one final surge of strength, she stepped into the light. The shadows recoiled, hissing, but it was too late. She was free. The darkness was behind her, fading into nothingness, swallowed up by the brilliance of the light. Her body felt lighter, freer than it had ever been. And then silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. She was whole again. Sasha looked around, taking in the pure, white light that enveloped her, the air clean, the pressure gone. She was free. And for the first time in so long, she felt alive. The light embraced her like an old friend, warm and soothing, its glow washing away the remnants of darkness that still clung to her skin. Sasha felt it, a sense of peace she hadn't known in what seemed like lifetimes. For the first time in so long, she was truly breathing, not just existing. Her mind was clear. The shadows that had once threatened to consume her had receded into nothingness, dissolved by the brilliance of the light she had fought so hard to reach. She took a step forward, her feet sinking into soft, familiar ground. It wasn't the cold, desolate place she had been in before. No longer suffocated by the oppressive weight of the darkness, she felt free, truly free, for the first time. Sasha closed her eyes, just for a moment, allowing the stillness around her to wash over her. It was the kind of peace she had forgotten existed, the kind that seemed almost unreal after the endless struggle. But there was no fight left. Her fingers twitched, a small reminder of her body's return to its own control, no longer lost to the shadows. She reached up to her face, feeling her skin, the warmth of it, the pulse of life beneath her fingertips. A soft breath escaped her lips, a small but profound exhale, as if letting go of everything she had held inside for so long. The voice, the one that had tormented her, twisted her, made her doubt, was gone. No more whispers in her mind. No more echoes of the reflection that had sought to drag her back into the abyss. She was herself again. Sasha opened her eyes and looked ahead. The light was fading now, not in a way that felt threatening, but in a way that allowed her to see more clearly. Ahead of her was a path, stretching out into the distance. A choice. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't fleeing from anything. For the first time, she was walking forward, free to choose her own direction. The past was behind her, and with each step she took, the weight of it became lighter. The light dimmed, but Sasha wasn't afraid. She knew, now, that she could face whatever came next. And she would. With the freedom of her own soul, she moved forward.